Welcome to Baker Street Sleuth. The fire is warm, but the mystery tonight is chilling. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from?
Do like and subscribe for more tales from the archives. And please, leave your story suggestions in the comments.
London fog lay thick upon the city that autumn evening in 1892. At 221 B. Baker Street, Holmes sat idle, craving challenge, his Stradivarius silent in its case. Then came the urgent knock, 3 sharp raps echoing up the 17 steps. Signor Vittorio del Nero, renowned Italian virtuoso, found his priceless Cremonese violin vanished from its locked display case at the Royal Academy of Music during a private rehearsal. The doors bolted from within, windows sealed against the Thames mist, no trace of forced entry. Scotland Yard saw a simple inside theft by a jealous rival, but Holmes saw a link, the faint scent of rosine and something metallic on the velvet lining. One link in a chain that would bind a killer. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The First Link. I set down these events as they occurred in the autumn of 1892, when the fogs of London lay heavier than usual upon the city, carrying the sharp sting of coal smoke and the dank, a earthy rot rising from the Thames mud along the embankments. The bitter cold penetrated even the thick velvet curtains of our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, where the coal fires snapped and crackled, sending warm orange light dancing across the scattered chemical apparatus on the deal table, the worn Persian rug, and the Stradivarius violin resting silent in its open case upon the mantel. Holmes had spent the previous days in a state of profound ennui, it pacing rapidly back and forth before the hearth, long fingers steepled thoughtfully beneath his chin, occasionally drawing upon his pipe with that peculiar intensity which always signalled the approach of some fresh puzzle worthy of his powers. The 17 steps leading up from the street creaked sharply under hurried feet that evening. Mrs. Hudson's voice rose from below, brisk and slightly apologetic. "Signor Vittorio del Nero, to see you, gentlemen. He appears most distressed." The visitor who mounted the stairs and entered our room was a tall, slender man of perhaps 40 years, with the graceful carriage of one long accustomed to the concert platform. Yet at that moment his olive features were drawn tight with anxiety, his dark eyes wide and restless. His black overcoat glistened with the damp sheen of London fog, and his polished boots left faint, wet impressions of cobblestones upon our hearthrug. A strong odour of fine tobacco clung to his clothing, mingled with the faint, sweet, resinous scent of rosa that always marked the hands of a serious violinist. "Mr. Holmes," he began at once in careful, accented English, "I come in desperation. My violin, my very soul, has vanished, impossible, inexplicable. The Cremonese, a Stradivari of 1714, priceless, worth more than 5,000 guineas, locked securely in its case during a private rehearsal at the Royal Academy of Music. I stepped out for no more than 5 minutes to speak with the director in the corridor. When I returned, the case stood open, empty. The doors of the room had been bolted from the inside the entire time. No one could have entered." Holmes rose smoothly from his chair, his grey eyes suddenly alight with that peculiar keen light I had come to recognize so well. "Pray be seated, Signor del Nero. Watson, the brandy. If you please. Our guest has been walking in the fog and looks half frozen." Del Nero sank gratefully into the basket chair, his long, expressive hands trembling slightly as he accepted the glass. "The police arrived quickly, Inspector Gregson himself. He questioned me most rudely. suggested either I had contrived the disappearance myself for the insurance money, or that someone had obtained a duplicate key. An insult. I would cut my own throat before I parted with that instrument willingly. Holmes resumed his seat, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe, the blue smoke curling upward to mingle with the coal fumes from the fire. "Compose yourself, Signor, and describe the rehearsal room in exact detail. Omit nothing, however trivial it may seem." The room, Del Nero explained, was on the first floor of the Academy building, overlooking the busy thoroughfare of Marylebone Road. A heavy brocade curtains had been drawn against the gas lights and the thickening fog outside. A single small table stood in the centre, upon which rested the velvet-lined case containing the violin. Nearby sat one plain wooden chair, and a music stand holding the score for the Brahms sonata he had been practicing. No other furniture cluttered the space. The windows were tall but firmly latched, the fog pressing against the glass like a pale, suffocating shroud. The door was of solid oak, just fitted with a heavy brass lock and bolt. Del Nero carried the only key upon a thin gold chain about his neck. "And the case itself?" Holmes inquired. "Locked as well. I possess the sole key." Del Nero drew forth the small ornate key and placed it in Holmes's extended palm. Holmes held it to the lamplight, turning it slowly, examining every surface with his lens. No fresh scratches or marks of tampering, and yet the instrument is gone. That very night we accompanied the distraught musician back to the Academy in a hansom cab, the iron-shod wheels clattering loudly over the wet cobblestones, the fog-horns moaning mournfully from the direction of the river. The great stone building loomed dark and silent, its facade slick with condensation. Inside, the rehearsal room retained the chill of the night. The air smelled of old varnish, settled dust, and the faint metallic tang of brass instruments left in their stands in the corridor beyond. The velvet-lined case lay open upon the table, empty save for the bow still cradled in its slot. Holmes knelt at once, nostrils flaring as he inhaled deeply. Rosin, of course, the sweet piney scent of good colophony, but beneath it, something sharper, not gunpowder, carbolic perhaps, or a trace of some metallic compound. His long fingers moved carefully over the crimson lining. Here, a fine dust, almost invisible. Metallic particles, very light, adhering to the velvet, not from the bow hairs, nor from the strings. He rose to his full height. "The first link, Watson. The violin did not dissolve into air, or depart by supernatural means. It was removed by human agency, yet without forcing the door, or breaking either lock." We turned our attention to the windows. One of the tall casements showed the slightest play in its latch. Holmes produced his lens once more and bent close. He'd fresh marks, minute, but unmistakable. A thin blade or wire inserted from outside to lift the catch. The window was opened, if only for a moment. "But the drop to the street below!" Del Nero cried. 15 feet at least, and the fog so dense that a man on the pavement would be invisible from here. "Precisely," Holmes replied calmly. "A rope lowered from the roof, perhaps, or a light ladder positioned briefly in the fog. The act was swift and silent." He crossed to the door and bent to the keyhole, sniffing intently. "A faint odour here, sweet, almost almond-like, but not prussic acid. Something subtler, perhaps a solvent or oil used to ease the mechanism without leaving obvious traces." He straightened and glanced at me. "Observe also the temperature, Watson. The room is cold as the street outside, yet the velvet in the case still retains a faint residual warmth. The instrument was removed very recently, within the hour preceding discovery." Del Nero wrung his hands. "But how can such a thing be done? And by whom?" Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "We shall discover both in due course. First, let us list those who might have wished to possess, or to destroy, such a treasure." Reluctantly, Del Nero named them. Professor Hargreaves, the Academy's ambitious director, who had long resented the acclaim lavished upon foreign virtuosi. Miss Elena Voss, a talented young English violinist humiliated when she lost a major competition to Del Nero the previous season. Mr. Reginald Blackwood, a wealthy collector who had once offered 10,000 guineas for the Cremonese and been refused. Monsieur Lefebvre, a French dealer with a shadowy reputation for handling questionable rarities. And young Tommy Finch, the porter who cleaned the rooms and might have observed more than he admitted. 5 possible links already, Holmes murmured, almost to himself. Yet one, or more, will prove false when tested. We returned to Baker Street in the small hours. The coal fire had burned low, leaving the room warm but heavy with the mingled scents of tobacco and smoke. Holmes paced slowly, then took up his own violin, drawing from it a few soft, mournful notes that seemed to echo the mystery we had encountered. "The first link forged, Watson," he said at last, setting the instrument aside. "The violin was extracted through the window, not carried through the locked door. A chain begins to form. Others will follow, link by link, until the truth binds our quarry fast." The link was there, plain for those who looked. Did you forge it before Holmes revealed it? Chapter 2. Forging Connections. The following morning broke grey and raw, the fog still clinging stubbornly to the rooftops and chimneys of Baker Street like wet flannel. I awoke to the familiar mingled smells of Mrs. Hudson's strong coffee rising from below and the sharp, aromatic bite of Holmes's shag tobacco already burning in his pipe. He stood by the window, long silhouette framed against the pale light, studying the street below where hansom cabs clattered past on slick cobblestones, and the occasional foghorn moaned from the direction of the river. "We return to the Academy presently," he announced without turning. "But first, we must forge connections with those who stood nearest the empty case. 5 names, 5 possible motives. Let us see which links hold and which bend." Our first visit was to Professor Archibald Hargreaves, in his cluttered office on the upper floor of the Royal Academy. The room smelled of old leather bindings, carbolic soap from the daily scrubbing, and the faint musty odour of yellowing sheet music stacked in precarious towers. Hargreaves received us behind a broad oak desk, his mutton chop whiskers quivering with barely concealed irritation. He was a stout man of 50-odd years, dressed in a frock coat that had seen better decades. "Del Nero is theatrical, Mr. Holmes," he said at once, voice clipped and precise. "Always has been. The violin was valuable, yes, but this tale of a locked room and vanishing instrument? Pure opera. More likely, he mislaid it in one of his dramatic transports, and now seeks to cast blame." Holmes seated himself unhurriedly, drawing upon his pipe until the bowl glowed. "You were present in the building during the rehearsal hour?" "In this very office, correcting examination papers, alone." "And you did not leave the room?" "Not once." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your boots, Professor. Freshly blacked this morning. Yet I observe a thin rim of reddish Thames mud still adhering to the outer edge of the heel. Curious, for a man who claims never to have stepped beyond these walls yesterday evening. Hargreaves flushed a deep crimson. I took a brief constitutional along the embankment earlier today, nothing more. Yet the mud is still damp, Holmes observed mildly, and the fog last night was especially thick near the river. The link was there, subtle but unmistakable. Did you forge it before Holmes spoke? We left the professor frowning at his papers and made our way to the modest lodgings of Miss Helena Voss, near the quieter end of Regent's Park. The small sitting room was sparsely furnished, and the fire small and struggling against the chill. Miss Voss received us with nervous courtesy, her slender hands marked by the telltale calluses of daily practice. She wore a plain grey dress, yet her posture retained the proud carriage of one who has stood upon many platforms. "I admired Signor Del Nero," she said softly, voice trembling only a little. "His tone, his phrasing, everything. I would never wish him harm, nor covet his instrument. But the competition last spring," Holmes prompted gently. She looked down at her lap. "I lost. The judges preferred his interpretation of the Paganini caprices. It stung. Yet envy is not theft." Holmes leaned forward. "You practiced yesterday afternoon?" "Of course. Every day. Your left cuff bears a fresh rosin stain, quite distinct, and your hands tremble slightly as you pour the tea. Bitter stuff, this. Chicory rather than coffee. Economy. Perhaps." She set the cup down with a faint clink. "I have not slept well since the news." Watson missed it entirely at first. "Did you spot the tremor that spoke of more than sleeplessness?" Our next call took us to the imposing Mayfair residence of Mr. Reginald Blackwood. The house smelled richly of polished leather, old brandy, and the faint sweetness of cigar smoke that lingered in the heavy draperies. Blackwood received us in a smoking room, lined with glass-fronted cases containing violins, violas, and cellos of every period. He lounged in a deep armchair, velvet smoking jacket open at the throat, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "I offered Del Nero 10,000 guineas for that Cremonese 2 years ago," he said with a thin smile. "He refused, called it priceless, irreplaceable, foolish pride. Now it is gone, and I am not surprised." "You collect Stradivari instruments?" Holmes inquired. "Among others. A small but discerning collection." Holmes strolled to one of the cases and bent close to the velvet backing behind a Guarneri. "This display was recently cleaned, I observe, yet a faint metallic dust, very fine, still clings to the nap in one corner, similar to the residue in Del Nero's empty case." Blackwood's smile tightened. "My staff are meticulous, but no one is perfect." The connection seemed almost invisible at first. "Can you see it beginning to form?" We pressed on to a small, smoky café near Covent Garden where Monsieur Lefebvre preferred to conduct business. The air reeked of strong garlic, cheap tobacco, and the sour tang of spilled wine. The Frenchman greeted us with expansive gestures and a laugh that did not reach his eyes. "Vanished violin! Poof!" He snapped his fingers. "Perhaps Signor Del Nero needs money. Insurance pays, no questions asked. Simple." His cufflinks caught the gaslight. Gold, finely engraved with intertwined initials. Holmes noted them without comment. "You deal in rare instruments, monsieur. Any recent transactions involving Cremonese or similar?" "None at present." Lefebvre's gaze flickered briefly to the door. "Last we sought young Tommy Finch, the Academy porter, in the damp basement warren beneath the main building. Coal dust clung to his hands and the cuffs of his rough serge jacket. The air smelled of wet stone, hot iron from the boilers, and the ever-present Thames mud tracked in on boots. He shifted uneasily as we questioned him. "I saw nothing, gentlemen. I was stoking the boilers all evening, never went near the rehearsal rooms." "Your boots tell another story," Holmes said quietly. "The same reddish Thames clay that marks Professor Hargreaves's heels. You walked together by the river, perhaps?" Tommy paled. I only stepped out for air, sir. Nothing more." Links were multiplying now, each observation slotting into place like pieces of iron heated in the forge, and the chain was taking shape, still incomplete, still fragile in places, yet growing stronger with every step we took. Back at Baker Street that evening, Holmes stood before the fire, pipe in hand, watching the coals settle. The room was warm, heavy with tobacco smoke and the faint crackle of burning coal. He spoke almost to himself. 5 suspects, Watson. 5 possible motives. Yet already certain links begin to bend under scrutiny, while others harden. The chain grows heavier. Soon it will be strong enough to bind the truth. What chain would you build from these scattered observations? Chapter 3. The Chain Grows. The fog had lifted slightly by the 3rd morning, yet a damp chill still hung over Baker Street, carrying the ever-present smell of coal smoke from 100 chimneys, and the faint brackish tang of the Thames drifting northward on the breeze. I found Holmes already dressed and restless, after standing before the fire, with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, staring into the flames as though the coals themselves might yield the next link. The room was warm, the coal fire crackling steadily, but the air held the lingering sharpness of his tobacco, mingled with the faint carbolic scent that always clung to his coat after visits to the morgue or police stations. "We return to the scene," he announced abruptly. "Not as casual observers this time, Watson, but as men hunting for the thread that connects what has so far appeared disconnected. The chain grows only when we test each link under pressure." We took a hansom cab back to the Royal Academy, the iron wheels grinding over wet cobblestones, the horses' hooves clopping in steady rhythm beneath the driver's low curses at the traffic. The building stood quiet in the mid-morning light, its stone facade still glistening from the night's mist. Inside, the rehearsal room felt colder than before, and the air heavy with old varnish, settled dust, and the persistent metallic undertone we had noticed previously. Holmes went directly to the window, the one with the loosened latch. He opened it now with deliberate care, leaning out to examine the exterior sill. The drop to the narrow alley below was indeed steep, perhaps 16 feet to the uneven paving stones slick with damp. He produced his lens and bent close to the brickwork just beneath the window frame. "Here. Watson, observe," his voice sharpened with interest. 3 faint horizontal scratches on the brick, each no more than an inch long, spaced precisely 18 inches apart. Fresh, too, no weathering, no moss in the grooves. And below them, a small smear of what appears to be lamp-black mixed with oil. I peered over his shoulder. A ladder? Too short for a full ladder? A folding hook ladder, perhaps? Light, portable, used by housebreakers and chimney sweeps. The hooks would bite into the mortar joints. But notice the spacing. 18 inches exactly. That is not the standard gauge of most portable ladders sold in London. He straightened. The first link of this visit. The window was forced open from outside with a tool of uncommon design. We moved back to the velvet-lined case. Holmes lifted it carefully and turned it over. On the underside of the base, almost invisible against the dark wood, was a tiny circular mark, barely a quarter-inch across, where the varnish had been slightly abraded, as though something small and hard had pressed against it with force. "Another link," he murmured. "Pressure applied here from beneath, while the case rested on the table. Not the weight of the violin itself. The instrument is too light. Something else." He set the case down and began a slow circuit of the room, eyes sweeping floor, walls, ceiling. Near the door, half hidden beneath the edge of the threadbare rug, lay a single short length of fine steel wire, perhaps 4 inches long, curled at one end like a tiny hook. Holmes lifted it with his forceps and held it to the light. Steel, tempered, very thin. The curl suggests it was bent around a small cylinder, perhaps the stem of a key or the barrel of a tiny mechanism. And smell it, Watson. I leaned close. Beneath the metallic coldness came a faint, sweetish odour, almost like bitter almonds, yet softer. "Not prussic acid," Holmes said at once. "Oil of bitter almonds, used in minute quantities to mask other smells, or as a solvent for certain resins. Interesting." He pocketed the wire and turned to me. "The chain grows stronger now. The violin was not simply lifted out. It was extracted with precision, likely by a device small enough to pass through the opened window latch, operated from outside. The wire hook suggests a miniature grapple, or snare, as the pressure mark beneath the case indicates the instrument was pulled downward slightly before being lifted free. And the oil of almonds, perhaps to silence any faint metallic click as the mechanism engaged. The link formed clearly before me now. Did you see how these scattered traces began to connect? We left the rehearsal room and descended to the basement to speak again with Tommy Finch. The boy was shoveling coal into the boiler, sweat gleaming on his soot-streaked face, and the air down here was hot and thick with coal dust and the sharp smell of hot iron. "You were near the rehearsal rooms that evening," Holmes said without preamble. Tommy straightened, wiping his brow. "Only passing, sir, to check the pipes. Your coat pocket bulges slightly on the left side. May I see?" Reluctantly, the boy drew out a small tin box. Dentist's pattern, the kind used to carry instruments. Inside lay a few tiny screwdrivers, a coil of fine wire, and a phial half full of colourless liquid. "Oil of bitter almonds," Holmes said softly, "and wire of precisely the gauge we found upstairs." Tommy's face drained of colour. I only carry them for repairs, sir. Locks, hinges, odd jobs." "Yet you were seen near the river with Professor Hargreaves," Holmes continued. "The same mud on your boots, and your hands tremble now, not from the heat of the boiler, but from fear." The boy looked ready to bolt. Holmes laid a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Tell the truth, lad. Did someone pay you to leave the wire and oil where they might be found?" Tommy swallowed hard. "A gentleman gave me 5 sovereigns, said it was a joke on Signor Del Nero, to make him think his precious violin was stolen. I never touched the instrument, sir. I swear it." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Describe the gentleman." "Foreign, French maybe, dark coat, gold cufflinks. Said his name was Lefebvre." The major deductive leap landed with quiet force. The chain now stretched from the window scratches to the wire beneath the rug. from the oil to the frightened porter, from the metallic dust to the collector Blackwood's display cases. Not a simple theft, but an elaborate deception layered over something darker. Back at Baker Street that evening, the fire burned bright, the room warm and fragrant with tobacco and brandy. Holmes sat in his armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, drawing slowly upon his pipe. "I recall a case some years ago," he said reflectively. "The matter of the engineered emerald in the possession of the Duchess of Penrith. A stone reported stolen from a locked safe, yet the safe remained untouched. Scotland Yard declared it an inside job, but I observed a single scratch on the velvet tray, similar to the mark beneath Del Nero's case, and a faint odour of oil of almonds on the lock. It transpired the emerald had been replaced with a paste replica by a servant using a miniature suction device lowered through a ventilation grill. The servant was paid by a rival collector who wished to discredit the Duchess's collection. The parallel is striking, Watson. In both instances, the theft was staged to appear impossible, yet the physical traces, minute pressure marks, chemical odours, specialist tools, betrayed the mechanism, and the criminal relies upon the assumption that no one will look closely enough. But observation defeats deception when pursued without prejudice. He set the pipe aside. The chain grows stronger with every link we forge. Logic binds what appeared chaotic. What does this new evidence tell you now? How many links did you count in today's discoveries? Chapter 4. Testing the links. The fourth day dawned with a thin, pale sunlight, struggling through the persistent London fog, it turning the streets of Baker Street into a world of muted greys and muted sounds. The air outside carried the sharp bite of coal smoke from 1,000 chimneys. The damp rot of yesterday's rain-soaked newspapers clinging to the curbs, and the ever-present oily tang of the Thames drifting inland. Inside 221B, the coal fire burned steadily, warming the room and filling it with the comforting crackle of logs, and the faint sweetness of Holmes's tobacco rising from his pipe. He stood before the mantel, eyes half closed, as though listening to some distant music only he could hear. "We have forged several links, Watson," he said at length, "but a chain is only as strong as its weakest member. Today we test them, rapidly, ruthlessly, until the false ones shatter and the true ones stand revealed." Our first test came swiftly. We returned to Mayfair and the opulent house of Mr. Reginald Blackwood. The collector received us in the same leather-scented smoking room, though this time he seemed less at ease, his fingers drumming upon the arm of his chair. Holmes wasted no time. "You stated that your display cases were recently cleaned," he began, "yet the metallic dust we observed matches precisely the particles in Del Nero's empty case. I should like to examine your cleaning supplies." Blackwood hesitated, then rang for his butler. A small tin of polishing compound was brought. Holmes opened it, sniffed, dipped a finger. Lamp black and mineral oil, and no metallic residue. Curious. Yet the dust in both places is iron oxide, fine rust, almost powder. Blackwood's smile faltered, perhaps from an older instrument. "Perhaps," Holmes said evenly, "or perhaps from a hidden safe mechanism in one of your cases, designed to open silently, but leaving microscopic traces when used hastily." The collector paled. Weak link number 1 began to bend. We moved next to Monsieur Lefebvre's favourite haunt near Covent Garden. The café was quieter this morning, is smelling of stale coffee, spilled wine, and the sour edge of yesterday's garlic. Lefebvre sat at his usual corner table, gold cufflinks catching the gaslight. Holmes placed the short length of tempered wire we had found beneath the rehearsal room rug directly before him. "This wire," Holmes said, "matches the coil in Tommy Finch's tin. The boy claims you paid him 5 sovereigns to plant it. A joke, he was told." Lefebvre laughed too loudly. "Absurd! I have never met the boy. Your cufflinks bear the initials J.L., Jacques Lefebvre. Yet the boy described a man with precisely those cufflinks. And your left sleeve bears a faint smear of lamp black, identical to that on the window brickwork." Lefebvre pushed back his chair. "You have no proof." "I have observation," Holmes replied. "And the oil of bitter almonds on the wire. You use it to mask odours in your trade. The link holds for now." Weak link number 2 cracked audibly. Our third test took us to the academy once more, this time to Professor Hargreaves's office. The room still smelled of old books and carbolic, but the professor's manner had grown defensive. Holmes laid before him a small envelope containing scrapings from the reddish Thames mud on his boots. "This mud," Holmes said, "is peculiar to a stretch of riverbank near Wapping Old Stairs, where barges unload iron ore for the foundries. You claim to have walked only along the embankment near Westminster." Hargreaves shifted. "I may have wandered farther than I recalled." "And you met young Finch there. 5 sovereigns changed hands. Not from you directly, but through an intermediary. Lefebvre?" The professor's face drained of colour. "I had nothing to do with the violin." "Yet you resented Del Nero's presence. His success threatened your authority. A stage theft would discredit him, perhaps force his resignation." Hargreaves stammered. The link buckled. We pressed on to Miss Elena Voss's lodgings. She opened the door herself, eyes red-rimmed, hands trembling more violently than before. Holmes spoke gently. "Your rosin stain on the cuff is fresh, yet you claim not to have practised since the theft, and the tremor in your hands is not mere nerves. Laudanum, perhaps." She sank into a chair. I cannot sleep. It was the competition loss. It broke something in me. But you were seen near the Academy alley that evening. A woman in a grey cloak. The fog was thick, but the silhouette was unmistakable." Tears welled. "I only wanted to hear him play once more. From outside, I swear I took nothing." Holmes studied her a long moment. "This link holds. You are innocent of theft, though not of suffering." One weak link shattered completely. Our final test of the morning was with Tommy Finch in the Academy boiler room, and the heat was fierce, the air thick with coal dust and the metallic smell of hot iron. The boy looked ready to collapse. "You were paid to plant the wire," Holmes said, "but you also opened the window latch from inside before leaving for the boilers. A simple hook through the gap, lifted with string. You then lowered the same string to the alley, where someone waited with the folding ladder." Tommy nodded miserably. "They said no one would be hurt. Just a prank. I needed the money. My mother's medicine." "Who gave the signal?" Holmes asked. "A whistle, 3 short notes from the alley. I heard it just after Signor Del Nero stepped into the corridor." Holmes turned to me. "The chain is clarifying, Watson. The theft was mechanical, staged to appear impossible, orchestrated by someone with knowledge of Del Nero's habits and access to specialist tools. Lefebvre supplied the mechanism, Hargreaves the motive of professional jealousy, Blackwood the metallic dust from his own secret compartments, yet none acted alone. A coalition of weak links, each believing themselves insulated. We returned to Baker Street in the early afternoon. The fog had thickened again, muffling the clatter of hansom wheels and the distant chime of Big Ben. Holmes paced before the fire, pipe in hand, the room warm with coal heat and fragrant with tobacco. 5 suspects tested, he said. 3 links weakened almost to breaking. Lefebvre, Hargreaves, Blackwood. 1 innocent, Miss Voss. 1 unwitting tool, Finch. Yet the true chain remains hidden beneath these lesser ones. The orchestrator stands apart, using each man's greed or fear as a link in his own design. He stopped, eyes gleaming. The weak links have shattered under pressure. Now the true chain emerges, stronger, simpler, forged of colder motive. What weak link surprised you most when it broke? Can you see which shadow still stands behind them all? Chapter 5. The Chain Titans. By the 5th morning, the fog had thickened once more into a choking yellow pall that pressed against the windows of 221B Baker Street, carrying with it the heavy stench of coal smoke, wet horse dung from the street below, and the distant briny rot of the Thames. Inside, the coal fire burned fiercely against the cold, filling the room with warmth and the mingled scents of Holmes's strong shag tobacco, and the faint carbolic trace that still clung to his coat from the previous day's exertions. He stood motionless before the hearth, pipe clenched between his teeth, eyes fixed upon the dancing flames as though reading some urgent telegram written in their flicker. "The time for testing has passed, Watson," he said suddenly. "The chain now tightens, but we have but one more link to forge, and it will lead us directly to the hand that pulled the strings." He reached for his ulster and deerstalker. "We go at once to Blackwood's house in Mayfair. The collector knows more than he has admitted, and tonight he will speak, or the chain will bind him as surely as it will the true culprit." We took a hansom cab through the murk, the horse's hooves thudding dully on the sodden cobblestones, and the driver coughing into his scarf as the foghorns groaned along the river. Blackwood's grand residence loomed ahead, gaslights burning dimly behind heavy curtains. The butler admitted us with visible reluctance, and we were shown into the smoking room, where the air hung thick with leather polish, old brandy, and the sweet undertone of cigar ash. Blackwood rose from his armchair, face pale beneath the lamplight. "Holmes, this is unseemly. It is past 10 o'clock. "Precisely," Holmes interrupted. "The hour when collectors of rare instruments feel safest and most vulnerable. Show me the Guarneri in the far case, the one you claimed was recently cleaned." Blackwood hesitated, then crossed to the glass-fronted cabinet and unlocked it with a small key from his watch chain. As the door swung open, Holmes stepped forward swiftly and ran his fingers along the inner velvet lining. A faint metallic click sounded, almost inaudible, and a narrow panel slid aside, revealing a shallow compartment behind the instrument. Inside lay a folded black cloth, and beneath it something long and slender, wrapped in oilskin. Holmes lifted the bundle without hesitation. He unwrapped it carefully. A miniature folding hook ladder, light bamboo and silk cord, hooks tipped with rubber to silence impact, precisely 18 inches between rungs. Blackwood staggered back. I can explain. "No need," Holmes said coldly. "You supplied the ladder to Lefebvre, who in turn equipped young Finch. But the true prize was never the Cremonese. It was the insurance claim Del Nero would have been forced to make. followed by scandal when the violin reappeared in your collection as a recovered piece bought legitimately from a private seller. Blackwood's knees buckled. He sank into a chair. It was not my idea. Lefebvre approached me. He said Del Nero had discovered my Guarneri was not entirely authentic, a clever forgery by a Venetian craftsman. Del Nero intended to expose me at the next Academy recital. Ruin me, Holmes's eyes gleamed. So you arranged the impossible theft to discredit him first. A man desperate enough to forge a Stradivari would surely forge an alibi, or a theft. The confrontation had become a chase of sorts. Blackwood lunged suddenly for the bell pull, but Holmes was faster. He seized the man's wrist and twisted it behind his back with economical force. "Watson, the cord from the window drape. We shall secure our guest until Gregson arrives." I bound Blackwood's wrists while Holmes stepped to the telephone apparatus in the hall, still a rarity in private homes, and summoned Inspector Gregson with terse instructions. But as we waited, Blackwood's voice rose in a desperate whisper. "There is more. The violin is not destroyed. It is hidden near the river, in a barge at Wapping. Lefebvre has it now. He means to sell it on the continent tonight." Holmes turned sharply. "The game changes. Watson, fetch your revolver. We pursue." We left Blackwood under the butler's astonished gaze and raced into the fog-bound streets. A fresh hansom carried us eastward through the city, past the looming silhouette of St. Paul's, down toward the Pool of London, where the barges lay moored like dark sleeping beasts. The air grew colder, sharper with river mud and tar, and the foghorn sounded closer, deeper. Hansom wheels clattered over uneven cobbles until we reached Wapping Old Stairs, where the Thames lapped black and oily against the stone. Holmes led the way down the slippery steps, lantern held low. 3 barges rocked gently at their moorings. On the middle one, a faint light glowed behind a tarpaulin-covered hatch. Voices, low, urgent, carried across the water in French. We crossed the narrow plank. Holmes kicked the hatch open. Inside, by the light of a single oil lamp, stood Monsieur Lefebvre, the Cremonese violin cradled in his arms like a child. He froze, eyes wide. "Step back, Lefebvre," Holmes said quietly. "The chain has reached you." Lefebvre's hand darted toward his coat pocket. I levelled my revolver. "Don't." He hesitated, then slowly raised his hands. The violin case lay open on a crate beside him, velvet lining stained with the same metallic dust we had first noticed. Holmes advanced, took the instrument gently, and examined it under the lantern. Unharmed, the true link at last. Lefebvre laughed bitterly. "You think Blackwood was the principal? He was only the dupe. Del Nero knew of the forgery and intended to blackmail us both. I arranged the theft to silence him forever. The violin was to be my payment." The breakthrough struck like a hammer on hot iron. Not mere theft, attempted murder disguised as theft. Del Nero had not been the victim of jealousy alone, but of a conspiracy to protect a criminal secret. Holmes secured Lefebvre with cord from the barge, then turned to me. "The chain tightens, Watson. No escape now." We stood on the damp deck as Gregson's men arrived minutes later, summoned by a boy Holmes had paid to run to the nearest police post. The fog rolled thicker, muffling the sounds of handcuffs clicking, and Lefebvre's muttered curses. Back at Baker Street in the small hours, the fire still glowed, the room warm against the night's chill. Holmes sat in his armchair, the recovered Cremonese resting across his knees, drawing a single long, pure note from its strings. The sound lingered in the tobacco-scented air. "I recall the Camberwell poisoning," he said reflectively, where a man staged his own disappearance to escape exposure of a forgery in his art collection. The clues were similar: minute pressure marks, chemical odours, a mechanical device. Yet there the motive was flight. Here it was murder masked as theft. The principle remains: the criminal forges an elaborate chain of deception, believing it unbreakable. But every link he adds only strengthens the one we forge in return. He set the violin aside. "The chain tightens. The quarry is bound. Tomorrow we draw the final length." Before Holmes explains fully, what does the recovered violin and Lefebvre's confession tell you now? Chapter 6. Links to the Past. The sixth day brought a bitter wind sweeping up from the river, rattling the windows of 221B Baker Street, and driving the last remnants of fog into ragged wisps against the grey sky. Inside, the coal fire roared against the cold, filling the room with welcome heat, and the thick, comforting smell of burning coal mingled with the sharp bite of Holmes's tobacco, and the faint, lingering sweetness of rosin from the recovered Cremonese violin that now rested safely on the side table. Holmes sat in his armchair, long legs stretched toward the hearth, a fingers absently plucking a single low string of his own Stradivarius. The sound vibrated softly through the warm air. "The physical chain is nearly complete, Watson," he said quietly. "Yet the strongest chains are those forged in motive. Today we uncover the history that links these men, Lefebvre, Blackwood, Del Nero himself, in a past transaction that ended in blood. We began at Scotland Yard, where Inspector Gregson had Lefebvre in custody. The interview room smelled of damp stone, stale tea, and the sour edge of fear sweat. Lefebvre sat handcuffed to the table, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a sullen, watchful silence. Holmes wasted no preamble. "You stated last night that Del Nero intended to blackmail you and Blackwood over a forgery. Tell us of the instrument in question." Lefebvre's eyes flickered. "The Guarneri in Blackwood's collection. Acquired 3 years ago through me. Del Nero examined it privately at a soirée in Belgrave Square. He recognized the varnish. Too modern. Too uniform. A copy by Giuseppe Rocca, skillfully aged but not flawless. He demanded 20,000 guineas in silence, or he would denounce Blackwood at the next Academy Gala and ruin both our reputations." Holmes leaned forward. "And you arranged the staged theft to silence him before he could speak?" Lefebvre nodded slowly. "Blackwood panicked. He funded the ladder, the wire, the payment to Finch. I handled the execution. We meant only to frighten Del Nero into silence. The violin was to be returned anonymously after a week, once he had withdrawn his threat. But he discovered the plan too soon." "Discovered how?" I asked. Lefebvre's voice dropped. "He confronted Blackwood 2 nights before the theft, in the collector's own study. Words were exchanged, harsh ones. Del Nero left with a threat to go to the press. Blackwood lost his temper, struck him with a heavy candlestick. The blow was fatal." A chill ran through me despite the warm room. Holmes's expression remained calm. "Yet Del Nero was found alive the next morning," he said. "No," Lefebvre whispered. "The body was never found because we disposed of it." Blackwood panicked again. I suggested the river. Waited, at low tide near Wapping. The theft was staged afterward to explain his disappearance. The violin was taken to make it appear he had fled with it, or been robbed and murdered by another hand. Holmes drew upon his pipe thoughtfully. The locked room, the bolted door, or the window latch, all elaborate theatre to conceal a simple crime of passion and greed. Lefebvre looked up, eyes hollow. Blackwood struck the blow. I only helped conceal it. The violin was never meant to vanish forever, only long enough to muddy the waters. The motive lay exposed now, raw and ugly. Not mere theft, but murder, followed by deception. The chain stretched backward through time to that fatal night in Belgrave Square. We left Lefebvre and went directly to Blackwood's Mayfair residence, and the house stood silent, curtains drawn. Gregson's men had sealed it after the previous night's arrest, but Holmes produced a key he had taken from the collector's pocket. Inside, the air was cold, heavy with leather, brandy, and the faint metallic scent of old blood long cleaned, but never fully erased. In the smoking room, Holmes went straight to the hidden compartment behind the guarneri. He removed the instrument and examined its label under strong lamplight. Roca, of 1850, yet the varnish bears traces of aniline dye, a substance unknown before 1860. A forgery, skillfully done, Del Nero would have known at a glance. He replaced the violin and turned to the fireplace. Above the mantel hung a small framed photograph, Blackwood, younger, standing beside a dark-haired man in a concert hall. The man held a violin. Holmes lifted the frame, turned it over. On the reverse, in faded ink, to Reginald, with gratitude for patronage, Vittorio del Nero, Milan, we 1887. 5 years ago, Holmes murmured. They were once friends, patron and artist. Then the Guarneri entered the collection, and the friendship soured into blackmail. We searched the study. In a locked drawer, Holmes opened with a pick. We found letters. Del Nero's hand, increasingly sharp in tone. The final one, dated 3 days before the murder. I will speak at the gala unless the sum is paid by Friday. Your secret is no longer yours alone. Holmes closed the drawer. All the past and present are now one unbroken chain. Blackwood struck the fatal blow to protect his reputation and fortune. Lefebvre aided the disposal and staged the impossible theft to provide a false narrative. Finch and Hargreaves were unwitting tools, paid to add credibility. Miss Voss, innocent entirely. The links connected fully in my mind. The metallic dust from Blackwood's secret compartment, the oil of almonds to silence the mechanism, and the ladder from his own collection of burglary curiosities, all pieces of a design born in fear of exposure. Back at Baker Street that evening, the wind howled outside, but inside the room was warm, the fire crackling, the air rich with tobacco smoke, and the faint sweet note Holmes drew from the recovered Cremonese. He set the violin down and paced slowly. I remember the case of the Abbey Grange, he said, voice low and reflective. A baronet murdered his wife's lover in a fit of jealous rage. Udachi then staged an elaborate burglary to throw suspicion elsewhere, broken windows, scattered papers, even a forged footprint in the garden. Yet the true chain lay in the motive. A hidden will that would have disinherited him. I found the link in a single pressed flower preserved in a book, a bloom the victim had given the wife years before. Here, too, the past betrayed them. A photograph, a letter, a forged violin, all silent witnesses to a crime rooted in betrayal and greed. And a criminal believes time erases evidence, but time only forges stronger links when observed without passion? He stopped before the fire, eyes gleaming in the glow. Past and present, one unbroken chain. Tomorrow we present it entire. How many threads from the past did you recognize weaving into this crime? Can you see now how every link was always there, waiting to be forged? Chapter 7. The Complete Chain. The 7th morning arrived crisp and clear, the first in days without the choking fog. A pale sun filtered through the curtains of 221B Baker Street, warming the room and casting long shadows across the Persian rug. The coal fire had burned low during the night, leaving a gentle heat and the faint lingering smell of tobacco, mingled with the sweet rosin scent that still clung to the recovered Cremonese violin on the table. Holmes stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching the street where hansom cabs moved briskly now that the mist had lifted. A Big Ben tolled the hour in the distance, each deep note vibrating through the glass. "The moment has come, Watson," he said without turning. "The chain is forged link by link. Today we gather the principles and draw it tight before them all. Gregson has arranged the meeting in Blackwood's smoking room at noon. Every suspect, every witness, none shall leave until the truth stands plain." We arrived at the Mayfair house shortly before 12. The heavy curtains were drawn back, letting cold daylight flood the room. The air smelled of polished leather, old brandy, and the sharp metallic tang of fear-sweat. Inspector Gregson stood near the door with 2 constables. His notebook was already open. Seated in a semicircle were the 5 we had named from the beginning. Signor Vittorio del Nero, pale but composed, the Cremonese now safely in his lap. Professor Hargreaves, whiskers bristling with indignation. Miss Elena Voss, hands folded tightly in her lap. Monsieur Lefebvre, handcuffed and sullen. And Reginald Blackwood, slumped in his own armchair, face ashen. Young Tommy Finch waited in the hall under guard, not yet required. Holmes took his place before the fireplace, tall and calm, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He spoke without preamble. "Gentlemen, and madam, the violin did not vanish. It was taken deliberately, by design, to conceal a murder. I shall now present the complete chain, link by link, so that no doubt may remain." He turned first to the physical evidence. Link 1. The window latch bore fresh marks from a thin blade lifted from outside. Link 2. 3 horizontal scratches on the brickwork below, spaced 18 inches apart, corresponding exactly to the rungs of a miniature folding hook ladder, later recovered from Mr. Blackwood's hidden compartment. Link 3. A short length of tempered steel wire found beneath the rehearsal room rug, curled at one end, coated with oil of bitter almonds to silence any metallic sound. Link 4. Fine metallic dust, iron oxide, adhering to the velvet lining of the empty case and matching particles in Blackwood's secret safe panel. Link 5. Residual warmth in the velvet when we first examined the case, proving the instrument was removed mere minutes before discovery. These physical links form an unbreakable sequence. A mechanical extraction device, operated from outside, as swift and silent. He moved to the timeline. Link 6. Signor Del Nero stepped into the corridor at precisely 8:47 p.m. to speak with Professor Hargreaves. Link 7. Tommy Finch, paid 5 sovereigns, opened the latch from inside moments earlier and lowered a string to signal the accomplice below. Link 8. The violin was extracted within the 5-minute window while Del Nero was absent. Link 9. The case was left open, the bow untouched, to suggest an impossible theft rather than simple removal. Link 10. The body of the true victim, Signor Del Nero himself, was already disposed of in the Thames 2 nights prior, making the staged theft a cover for his permanent disappearance. Del Nero stirred sharply. My body! I stand here alive. Holmes regarded him steadily. No, sir. You are not Vittorio Del Nero. The real Vittorio Del Nero died in Blackwood's study 3 nights ago, struck fatally with a candlestick in a quarrel over blackmail. You are an impostor, hired, I presume, by Lefebvre to play the victim and sustain the illusion until the violin could be sold abroad. The room went deathly still. The false Del Nero's hands tightened on the violin case. Holmes continued without pause. Link 11. Witness statements. Miss Voss saw a man in a dark coat near the alley, matching Lefebvre's description. Tommy Finch identified Lefebvre as the man who paid him. Professor Hargreaves met Finch by the river to pass instructions. Link 12. Motive links. The Guarneri in Blackwood's collection was a forgery by Giuseppe Rocca, acquired through Lefebvre. The real Del Nero discovered this and demanded 20,000 guineas in silence, or exposure at the Academy Gala. Blackwood struck the fatal blow in rage. Lefebvre disposed of the body and devised the impossible theft ruse to explain Del Nero's absence and provide a scapegoat narrative. He turned to the impostor. You were chosen for your resemblance and your skill on the violin, enough to fool casual observers for a few days. Lefebvre promised you half the proceeds from selling the genuine Cremonese on the continent. The man's face crumpled. He set the violin down as though it burned him. I knew nothing of murder. They told me Del Nero had fled the country, that this was insurance fraud. I was to act the part for 1 week. Holmes nodded once. You are guilty of conspiracy and impersonation, but not of blood. That charge belongs to Blackwood and Lefebvre. Blackwood surged to his feet. It was an accident. He threatened me, my reputation, my collection. Murder is never accident, Holmes said quietly. And Lefebvre, you struck the bargain knowing the risk. The chain is complete. Gregson stepped forward, a motioning to his men. Handcuffs clicked shut on Blackwood and Lefebvre. Hargreaves and Finch were led away for lesser charges, accessory, after the fact and conspiracy to defraud. Miss Voss rose, tears in her eyes, free at last. The impostor bowed his head, defeated. Holmes stood motionless until the room emptied. Then he turned to me, eyes gleaming with that peculiar light. Every link accounted for, Watson. Physical, timeline, witness, a motive, and the final connecting link, the substitution of the man himself. The chain is complete. I looked at him in quiet awe. Holmes, your powers never cease to astonish me. He gave a small, rare smile. It is only observation, my dear fellow, and the refusal to accept the impossible when the possible lies plain. The link was forged before our eyes. Did you see the final turn? The man we thought was the victim was the key to unraveling it all. Down chapter 8. Justice in chains. The 8th day dawned with a cold, clear light that seemed almost too bright after the long succession of fog-bound mornings. The streets of London rang with the sharp clatter of hansom cabs and the cries of street vendors, the air crisp with the smell of fresh coal smoke from kitchen fires, and the faint, clean bite of frost on the cobblestones. At 221 B. Baker Street, the coal fire burned steadily, warming the sitting room and filling it with the familiar sense of Holmes's tobacco. the faint sweetness of rosin from the Cremonese, and the bitter edge of strong coffee Mrs. Hudson had just brought up. Holmes stood by the window, watching the traffic below, his long fingers drumming absently against the pane. "Gregson has moved quickly," he said. "Blackwood and Lefebvre are to be arraigned this morning at Bow Street, but the impostor, whom we shall call the false Del Nero for convenience, has turned Queen's evidence in exchange for a reduced charge. The chain that bound them now drags them to justice." We took a hansom to Bow Street Magistrates' Court, the wheels rumbling over uneven stones, the horse's breath steaming in the chill. The courtroom smelled of old wood polish, ink, and the sour nervousness of those awaiting judgment. The benches were crowded, and reporters from the Times and the Pall Mall Gazette scribbled furiously, their pencils scratching like small insects. Inspector Gregson stood near the dock, notebook in hand, his face set in grim satisfaction. Reginald Blackwood was brought in first, wrists manacled, his fine Mayfair clothes rumpled and stained from the cells. He kept his head bowed, refusing to meet anyone's eye. The magistrate, a stern-faced man with steel-rimmed spectacles, I read the charge in measured tones: murder of Vittorio Del Nero, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, and fraud. Blackwood's voice, when he spoke to enter his plea, was barely audible. "Not guilty," he whispered. But the tremor in his words betrayed him. Lefebvre followed, still defiant despite the chains. His gold cufflinks had been removed, his dark coat hung loosely on his thin frame. When the charge was read, accessory to murder, conspiracy to stage a felony, a disposal of a body, he laughed once, a short bitter sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Guilty of nothing but bad company," he said in his accented English. The magistrate silenced him with a sharp rap of the gavel. The false Del Nero, his real name proved to be Marco Rossi, a minor violinist from Naples, was brought in last. He looked smaller without the confidence of his impersonation, his shoulders hunched. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy and impersonation, and in a low voice recounted how Lefebvre had approached him in Paris 2 weeks earlier with the offer: play the part of Del Nero for 7 days, claim the violin had vanished, then disappear with half the proceeds from its sale in Amsterdam. He swore again he had known nothing of the murder until after the fact. Holmes, seated beside me in the public gallery, watched without expression. When the magistrate asked if anyone wished to offer evidence before remand, Gregson stepped forward. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes has prepared a statement, Your Worship." Holmes rose smoothly, unfolded a single sheet of paper, and spoke in his calm, precise voice. "The chain of evidence is complete and unbreakable. Physical traces, the window scratches, the ladder rungs, the tempered wire, the metallic dust, prove mechanical extraction of the violin. Timeline evidence places the true Del Nero's death 2 nights before the staged theft. A witness testimony from Tommy Finch and the impostor Rossi confirms payments and instructions from Lefebvre and Blackwood. Motive is clear: protection of a forged Guarneri worth thousands in reputation and value. The body was weighted and consigned to the Thames at Wapping Old Stairs. Divers recovered it yesterday morning, identified by dental records, and the scar on the left forearm Del Nero acquired in a childhood accident. A murmur ran through the court. Blackwood's head dropped lower. Lefebvre stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. The magistrate nodded. Remanded in custody pending trial at the Old Bailey, next case. We left the courtroom as the next prisoner was led in. Outside, the cold air struck us sharply. Gregson joined us on the steps, lighting a cigar with hands that still trembled slightly from the gravity of the morning. "Clean work, Holmes," he said gruffly. "Scotland Yard would have called it suicide or flight. Without you, and the violin would be halfway to the continent, and Del Nero's name blackened forever." Holmes inclined his head. "The Yard provided the divers and the dental records. Observation alone is insufficient without corroboration." We walked to a nearby chop house for a late luncheon. The place smelled of grilled kidneys, hot gravy, and the damp wool of overcoats hung near the fire. Over plates of roast beef and bitter ale, Gregson explained the loose ends. "Miss Professor Hargreaves has been cautioned but not charged. His only crime was accepting money to mislead Del Nero about rehearsal times. He'll lose his position, but no prison. Tommy Finch faces juvenile proceedings. The magistrate may bind him over with a stern warning and restitution to his mother. Miss Voss is entirely cleared. Her only fault was an excess of admiration turned to melancholy." Holmes sipped his ale thoughtfully. "And the Guarneri?" "Confiscated as evidence. Experts from Hill's will authenticate the forgery. Blackwood's collection will be sold to satisfy claims from Del Nero's estate. The Cremonese returns to the Academy tomorrow under guard." I set down my knife and fork. "It seems almost too neat, Holmes. A man murdered, his death disguised as disappearance, and justice served without a single shot, fired or blow struck in anger." Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Justice is rarely dramatic, Watson. It is forged quietly, link by link, until the criminal finds himself bound beyond escape." We returned to Baker Street in the late afternoon. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the room. Holmes stood before the fire, drawing upon his pipe, the smoke curling upward in slow spirals. The recovered violin rested on its stand, gleaming softly in the firelight. Gregson's men had taken Blackwood and Lefebvre away in a Black Maria, chains rattling as the door slammed shut. The impostor Rossi was led off separately. Eshed bowed to face his own sentence. Outside, the city moved on, hansoms clattering, gaslights flickering to life one by one, the great wheel of London turning as though nothing had changed. Yet everything had. A killer bound, an innocent cleared, a priceless instrument restored. Justice, in its quiet, inexorable way, had closed around them all. The criminal is bound. Justice served. Chapter 9. Links restored. The 9th day brought a gentle thaw to London, of the frost melting from rooftops and dripping steadily from eaves. Filling the streets with the soft patter of water on cobblestones and the clean, wet smell of stone, freshly washed by the night's drizzle. At 221 B. Baker Street, the coal fire burned low and steady, its warmth spreading through the sitting room, where the air carried the faint sweetness of rosin, the lingering sharpness of Holmes's tobacco, and the comforting aroma of Mrs. Hudson's fresh-baked scones rising from the tray she had left on the side table. Holmes sat in his armchair, long legs across, reading the morning editions with a quiet satisfaction I had rarely seen. "The wheels of justice turn slowly, Watson," he remarked, folding the Times and setting it aside. "But they turn. Today we witness the restoration of order, the clearing of the innocent, the resolution of claims, and then the quiet return of normalcy to those who were unjustly shadowed. We began at the Royal Academy of Music in Marylebone, where the director's office now stood open and bright, sunlight streaming through tall windows onto polished floors that still smelled faintly of carbolic from the morning scrub. Professor Hargreaves had tendered his resignation the previous evening. His successor, a quiet, scholarly man named Dr. Ellison, greeted us with cautious courtesy. "Though the board has reviewed the evidence," Ellison said, handing Holmes a sealed envelope, "Miss Voss is reinstated without prejudice. Her scholarship is renewed, and she will give the opening recital next month, using the recovered Cremonese, if Signor Del Nero's estate permits." We found Elena Voss in the rehearsal room where the nightmare had begun. She stood alone by the window, violin case open on the table, fingers tracing the velvet lining as though reassuring herself it was real. As when she saw us, she turned, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot thank you enough. They believed me guilty by association. Whispers in the corridors, cold glances from colleagues. I thought my career was finished." Holmes inclined his head. "You were never guilty, Miss Voss, only human. Envy is not a crime. It is a shadow that passes when light is cast upon it." She lifted the Cremonese gently, tucked it under her chin, and drew a single pure note, long and steady, vibrating through the room like a sigh of relief. The sound lingered, rich and warm, carrying the scent of rosin and old wood into every corner. Next we went to the offices of Messrs. Crawley and Sons, solicitors to the Del Nero estate in Lincoln's Inn Fields. The chambers smelled of old paper, sealing wax, and the faint musty sweetness of leather-bound ledgers. Mr. Crawley, a thin, precise man with pince-nez spectacles, rose to greet us. "The estate is settled," he announced. Signor Del Nero's will, dated 2 years ago, leaves the Cremonese to the Royal Academy, on condition that it be played annually at a memorial concert in his name. The proceeds from his other assets will establish a scholarship for young Italian violinists studying in London. He paused, glancing at a document before him. "Mr. Blackwood's collection is forfeit to satisfy civil claims. The forged Guarneri has been surrendered to the authorities. Experts confirm it as a rocker copy. The proceeds from the legitimate instruments will go toward restitution." Holmes nodded. "And the impostor, Marco Rossi?" "Sentenced to 18 months hard labour for conspiracy and fraud. He has expressed remorse and offered to testify fully at the Old Bailey trial. Lefebvre and Blackwood face the gallows or transportation, depending on the jury's mood." Outside, the sun had climbed higher, gilding the plane trees along the square. We walked slowly toward the Strand, and the air fresh with the smell of wet earth from the gardens and the distant brine of the river. Hansom cabs splashed past, drivers calling for fares. A newsboy shouted headlines about the latest developments in the case. Our final call was to the modest lodgings near Regent's Park, where young Tommy Finch lived with his mother. The small parlour smelled of carbolic soap, damp laundry drying by the fire, and the faint sweetness of fresh bread. Mrs. Finch, a worn but dignified woman, who welcomed us with tea so strong it tasted almost of iron. Tommy stood in the doorway, cap in hand, eyes downcast. The magistrate had bound him over to keep the peace for 12 months, with an order to make weekly restitution from his wages as a porter's apprentice. "I never meant harm, sir," he said quietly. "I thought it was just a prank. I'll work it honest now. Never touch another man's coin." Holmes placed a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. The chain that bound you was weak, lad. Yet you broke it yourself by telling the truth. Remember that. Mrs. Finch pressed a small parcel into my hands, scones wrapped in cloth. For your trouble, gentlemen, and thank you for saving my boy from worse. As we left, the boy's mother stood at the door, watching us go. The street outside was alive with ordinary sounds, children laughing, a barrel organ playing in the distance, the rhythmic clop of horses on the wet road. London was returning to itself. Fog or no fog, crime or no crime. Back at Baker Street that evening, the room glowed with firelight. Holmes had tuned his Stradivarius and now played a slow, meditative air, something by Bach, simple and profound. The notes rose and fell, mingling with the crackle of coal and the soft hiss of gas lamps being lit outside. The Cremonese rested on its stand, a silent witness restored to its place in the world. I set down my journal and looked at him. The innocent are cleared, Holmes. The guilty await their sentence, and the violin is safe. Order is restored to London streets. He lowered the bow, eyes distant for a moment. Order is never fully restored, Watson. It is merely mended, link by link, but today the mend holds. Tomorrow another chain may form. Until then, we rest. The city outside moved on, gaslights flickering to life one by one, hansom wheels rumbling into the night, the great pulse of London beating steady once more. What link surprised you most in its restoration? Did you see how the chain, once broken, could be reforged stronger than before? Chapter 10. By the Fire at Baker Street. The 10th evening arrived quietly. The sky over London a deep indigo streaked with the last crimson of sunset. A gentle breeze stirred the curtains at 221B Baker Street, carrying the distant sounds of the city settling. The fading clatter of hansom cabs returning to their stables. The low chime of Big Ben marking the hour. The soft hiss of gas lamps being lit one by one along Baker Street. Inside our sitting room, the coal fire burned with a steady comforting glow, warming the air and filling it with the rich scent of burning coal, the faint aromatic bite of Holmes's tobacco, and the lingering sweetness of rosin that still clung to the recovered Cremonese, now safely returned to the Academy. Mrs. Hudson had left a tray of hot tea and brandy. The steam rose in slow spirals, carrying the bitter, comforting taste of strong assam. Holmes sat in his favourite armchair, legs stretched toward the hearth, pipe in hand, eyes half closed in that rare moment of repose. I occupied the opposite chair, journal open on my knee, pen still wet from recording the final details of the case. The room felt peaceful, almost domestic, a stark contrast to the tension and fog of the days before. "The newspapers have had their feast," Holmes remarked. Drawing slowly on his pipe, Blackwood and Lefebvre remanded without bail. Rossi sentenced to 2 years. Is the Cremonese to be played at the memorial concert in Del Nero's name? A tidy conclusion, Watson. Almost too tidy for London. I smiled. Yet it is complete. The chain held. He nodded, setting the pipe aside and reaching for his Stradivarius. He drew the bow across the strings in a slow, meditative phrase, something from Corelli, simple and profound. The notes hung in the warm air, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the faint pop of burning coal. When he finished, he rested the instrument across his knees and spoke in a quieter tone. Allow me, if you will, to reflect upon the method that brought us here. The chain of deduction is not magic, Watson, nor inspiration from on high. It is the patient forging of observation into logic, link by inexorable link. We began with the first faint traces, the metallic dust on velvet, the warmth in the lining, the scratches on brick. Each was meaningless alone. Together they formed shape. We tested them against human motive, against time, against falsehood, discarding the weak links until only the unbreakable remained. He paused, eyes on the flames. I recall the affair of the speckled band, how a single bell pull, motionless yet deadly, connected to a ventilator, to a bed fixed immovably to the floor, to the whistle in the night. A chain of physical facts so slight that most men would have overlooked them. Yet when forged together, they bound the murderer as surely as iron manacles. Here, too, the oil of bitter almonds silenced no lock, but it silenced doubt. The ladder rungs measured no ordinary climb, but they measured intent. The forged Guarneri was no mere instrument, but the motive that turned jealousy to murder. He leaned forward slightly, voice thoughtful. The science of deduction rests on this principle. The world remembers every step, every touch, every breath of deceit. A man may lie with his tongue, but his boots carry mud from places he denies visiting. His hands bear traces of substances he claims never to have handled. His eyes flicker when the chain begins to tighten around him. Observation defeats deception because deception is effort, and effort leaves marks. The criminal constructs an elaborate illusion, an impossible theft, a locked room, a vanished man, believing complexity will confound. But simplicity is our ally. Eliminate the impossible, and whatever remains, however improbable, I must be the truth. I set my pen down, and in this case, the improbable was the substitution of the man himself. We mourned a victim who was already dead, questioned a ghost who walked among us. Precisely, Holmes said. The final link was not a clue upon the floor or a mark upon a wall. It was the absence of true grief in the eyes of the man claiming to be Del Nero. The too perfect rehearsal of his story. The faint Neapolitan accent beneath the polished Italian. Small things, Watson. But always the small things. He rose and crossed to the window. Looking down at the street where a single gaslight burned steadily against the gathering dark. London is full of such chains waiting to be forged. A cry in the night, a footprint in the fog, a scent on the wind, each is a link. Our task is never to miss one. He turned back to me, a faint smile touching his lips. You have recorded this adventure faithfully, as always. Perhaps one day some reader, sitting by his own fire, will follow the links as we did and smile when the last one snaps into place. To them I say, look closely. The world speaks if you listen. Doubt everything that seems too convenient. Trust the evidence that endures. I close my journal. Until the next chain forges then. Holmes returned to his chair, took up his pipe once more, and drew a long, contented breath. Until the next, dear Watson. The game continues. The fire crackled softly. Outside, of the great city murmured on, hansoms fading into the distance, footsteps on wet pavements, the low note of a distant foghorn rising from the Thames. Inside 221B Baker Street, two old friends sat in companionable silence, the chain of one mystery complete, the promise of another already forming somewhere in the shadows beyond the lamplight. What small observation will you carry into your own life, dear reader? What link unnoticed by others might one day reveal a truth hidden in plain sight? Until that moment arrives, rest easy. The game continues.